Hello, everyone. My name is Alice MacLachlan, and I am Vice Provost and Dean of the Faculty of Graduate Studies here at York University. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the latest installment in our Scholarly Skills webinar series. Today's webinar is called Put Your Stress to Work, and we would like to describe it, my co-panelists and I would like to describe it as a slightly different take on a stress management webinar, focused particularly not so much on managing stress in the sense of putting it away so you can get on with things, but rather bringing stress into the toolbox of scholarly skills and tools that you have as you address your academic and research projects and work. It is my pleasure to introduce my co-panelists today, Professor Heather MacRae, Professor and Graduate Program Director in the Department of Political Science here at York University. And Heather is an admired and esteemed colleague of mine and an expert in putting her own stress to work. I know this both by reputation and up close and personal firsthand. And so we will be taking you through some of the tips, tricks, and tools that we have used for doing this. But before we do so, I would just like to take a moment, as always, to locate ourselves. Today, I am speaking to you from the campus of York University. Since this is a webinar online and some of you are joining us either through Zoom or through YouTube, I imagine we find ourselves in very different places around this particular land or around even perhaps around the globe. And so as I read out York's land acknowledgement, I want to invite you not to just gloss over this or tune me out for a minute, but to take this moment to think about where you are situated right now and what you know of the history, the tradition, and the stories that have led to you being in this land and what the stories of that land are. For our part on campus at York University behind me, I can say that we recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University's campuses are located. These precede the establishment of York University. The university acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto, where the university is located, has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So that's where we are today. And the next question is really why we are here. And I think it is a truth almost universally acknowledged that graduate school can be stressful. And that is the starting point where we take today's conversation. In fact, some people put it more dramatically and maybe just the tiniest bit more ableistly than I am, and saying the stress of graduate school can drive anyone temporarily mad. Taking that in a more universally inclusive way, we could say the stress of graduate school can make us feel not ourselves, not in control, not in the driver's seat, not able to manage things temporarily or longer term, and not having a sense that we are able to do the work that we have come to our research careers, to our professional careers here at university in order to do and pursue, and may even alienate us from the very passion that brought us to graduate school in the first place. And this is a dilemma because we've come to do this. This is stressful. This stress can alienate us from the passion and from the project. And what we want to offer, what Heather and I want to suggest today is we can help you manage what feels like a bit of a performative contradiction by helping you put your stress to work. So I'll start by giving a little bit of an overview of the webinar, and then we are going to take turns back and forth explaining some of the ways in which we have approached stress as a scholarly skill. And I actually want to take a moment just to offer credit to my co-panelists today. It was very much Heather who invited me to think of stress as a scholarly skill. And once she put the idea in my head, I realized not only is it a scholarly skill, it might be my main skill. So I appreciate knowing what it is. So thank you, Heather. So how do you put your stress to work? What are we going to talk about today? I've already covered the first point, which probably any of you at all involved in grad school already knew, namely that graduate school is stressful. That brings us to our next point. Since we have stress, it's an endemic part of what we're doing. How do we cultivate that stress as a skill and recognize those moments when it is no longer skillful, but is something taking us away from our scholarly skills instead of informing them. And so Heather and I will offer four sort of broad categories of approach for cultivating stress as a scholarly skill. And then we will touch on some more traditional stress management techniques, resources, sources of support and help for those times when stress is no longer skillful and no longer scholarly, which also happens to absolutely every single one of us in graduate school. So we will be discussing stress that can be cultivated and stress that needs to be managed, both of which are very real, very normal, very natural, and very present. And we hope by the end of it, you'll have a sense of not needing to be afraid of all the stress of graduate work, but understanding what can be harnessed, used, and put to good work, and what can be managed, addressed, dealt with, and acknowledged. So the techniques we're going to talk about fit under the categories of how to just start already, which is sometimes harder than it looks, the idea of structured versus stifling procrastination, the need to build your own structure, and of course, the longstanding aphorism and famous advice, know yourself. And then we'll talk about some tools for stress management. But I think what I'd like to do first is turn it over to Heather to talk about the big idea, how stress can be a scholarly skill.
All right. Thank you, Alice. Um, I should start this, I think, by saying that I'm not a psychologist. I don't actually have any of the sort of theoretical knowledge, if you will, that goes behind this. These are things that I have noticed largely in myself, and in the ways that I work, in watching a lot of students work, and sort of been being able to think about when are we successful and when are we not successful. So I think that actually stress is something that we may actually need in order to be productive. And what I mean by that, I'm not trying to suggest that we all have to be constantly pulling our hair out and not knowing where we're going and which way is up and which way is down. That's already beyond stress. That's into what I'm going to call anxiety. So I'm going to make the distinction, I think, between stress and anxiety, where at least for these purposes, stress is kind of that thing that can nudge us along. Whereas anxiety is already moving into that zone where we need to stop and think and take a good look at where are we at and look after our mental health. So I think this is sort of the distinction that we need to make. Um, as much as we all know that there are those stressful forms or those negative forms of stress, those stress that's not good for us, I'm going to try to make the case that some stress in controlled doses can actually be useful. But before I go that way, let's back up a bit and think about why are we actually, or why are you in grad school? And yeah, absolutely. It's to position yourself to get a job. Sure. It's maybe because you have something specific that you wanted to research, to study, to look into. And so I'd like to think that the ultimate goal of grad school is not just to produce that particular piece of work, but to learn and to grow. And so if that's our actual end goal, how are we going to reach that goal effectively? In other words, how are we learning effectively? And I think that learning happens in a bunch of different ways. Certainly, there is a degree of learning, and it is quite probably my favorite way to learn, where on a cold winter evening, I curl up in front of the fireplace in my big comfy couch, probably in my bathrobe with a cup of tea and a book. And that book can be just about anything. And absolutely, there is some learning that goes on. But that is really about my comfort zone. And I'm not sure that that's where my most effective deep learning happens. I think deep learning happens and requires us to be pushed out of that comfort zone. So there's a psychologist, a late psychologist by the name of Judith Bardwick, who wrote about how when we move from the comfort zone, we go into what she called first the fear zone and then the learning and growth zones. And I think that this little chart that I've taken from one of her books is actually really, really helpful in thinking about that. So, in order to learn and to grow and to acquire new skills, we need to move from the comfort zone into the fear zone. And this is where stress comes from. We all know we get stressed out when we're afraid. And so, actually, we need to start thinking about stress in the sense that it is that sign that we are taking the steps to become effective deep learners. We are now actually moving from what we already know into that less comfortable zone. And I think it's precisely because there is no clear roadmap. We don't know what we're about to learn. We don't know what's coming. We can't necessarily build on previous knowledge, although I think we can build on previous experiences as we go through this. It can be really anxiety provoking. But if you stick it out and you persevere, then you enter into that learning zone. And so that's what we really want to think about is how are we moving into that learning zone? Um, Stress is our body's reaction to that unknown. It's the way of trying to get us to go back into the comfort zone, to curl back up in front of the couch with the fireplace on and our cup of tea, and to feel like we're in control. But if you want to learn, you have to give up a little bit of control. So this is what I'm going to try to encourage everybody to do, I guess, is to be aware of how we step outside of that comfort zone and to find particularly your balance. We don't want to go so far out of that discomfort zone that you're actually off this chart. That's when you move into what I'm calling anxiety zone, and that's where stress leads to paralysis and inability to act. So what we're looking for is this Goldilocks zone, the sweet spot where we're challenging ourselves enough that we're out of our comfort zone, but we're not entering into the panic zone. Everybody's zone is a different size. And you need to figure out with trial and error where your perfect learning spot is. So, quickly, what does this actually look like practically? Let me give you an example from just this weekend from my son, who is just starting high school. He's in grade 9. He has relatively severe ADHD. So, all along through elementary school, we've had him working in teeny tiny little chunks, 10 minutes at a time, take your break, come back to it 10 minutes later. This was really easy when he had like 40 minutes of homework. High school is a little bit different. You need bigger chunks of attention, but that's really hard for him. So on the weekend, he had a big project he had to do. He went upstairs, he did 10 minutes of work. He comes downstairs, says, I'm taking a break. And I looked at my watch and I thought, we are never going to finish this project. This is not going to happen this way. So I said, no, back upstairs. I want you to finish at least this chunk of the project. And he sort of looked at me. He says, that's going to take like 30 minutes. Like, fine, then it's going to take 30 minutes. Go and do it. He went up, he actually did it. And when he came back down, he said, it was hard, but I think what I produced was way better. He says, what I wrote was better than when I do it in little pieces because I just focused on it. And I thought, well, thank you, son. You just gave me like the perfect anecdote for this little conversation. But it was for him, that comfort zone was really just being forced to sit for longer than he was used to. So maybe that's what is pushing you out of your comfort zone. Maybe it's changing the time frame that you work. But maybe it's more than that. And I think that a lot of it is then about trying to find your strategy, which is, I think, our next slide.
Absolutely. There you go.
Basically, there's no wrong place to start. You just gotta start. I love this little cartoon. I feel like this duck every single time I sit down to work. And you just have to figure out where to start. So for me, you need a strategy. Everybody's strategy will be unique to you. And I know that is not really helpful. But what I think is helpful about a strategy is realizing that a strategy is creating a routine. And a routine or a structure is what we need for our brains to recognize the patterns and to kick into the mode that we need to kick into. So if you work best in the coffee shop, you might find that the minute you walk into the coffee shop, if you've been doing this regularly, you kind of switch into a different way of thinking. You switch into a different mode. For me, it's my cup of coffee or tea in the morning. When I sit down at my desk with my cup of coffee, that is the signal to my brain that you're starting to work. And it's those little routines that create the structure and allow us, I think, to move into the process of being productive. So I think it's really key to create that structure. What is it that works for you? It might be your pens neatly arranged on your desk. It might be your coffee. It might be the place that you work. Set the stage for what works for you. Again, this is will come into know yourself. Take those few minutes at the beginning of the day to think about what you're going to do. It might look the same every day. It might look different every day. It might look this way always on Monday and this way's on Thursdays. But you need to sit down and set out for yourself in the morning or at the beginning of your work phase. I shouldn't say in the morning. My day happens to start in the morning. Not everybody's will. Take a few minutes and set up your plan. For me, make sure rewards are part of this process. Nobody expects you to sit down at your desk at some point in time and work for 8 hours straight through. That's absolutely non-human and unrealistic. There may be days that you need to push through more, but in a general rule, set out your rewards. What are your rewards? What works for you? Sometimes it's M&Ms for me. Sometimes it's going for a walk with the dog if it's a beautiful sunny day. Think about what's going to keep your brain mellow, if you will. What's going to let you reset when you take the break? Sometimes you'll see this worked into things like Pomodoro strategies. Work for 50 minutes, take 10 minutes off. If that works for you, go for it. For me, I actually hate it when the little bell goes off after 50 minutes and I'm in the perfect thought process and I just want to finish it. And so I don't work well with Pomodoro. That's okay. I have my own ways of sort of structuring that kind of process and knowing what is waiting for me at the end. And I think that's really, really important. Any progress is progress. And I think that's the other thing is to get us out of a negative mindset that says that we are not being productive. You are being productive. And I think in the next few minutes, we have a few other slides that sort of speak to that. But I'll share one more little anecdote here. I have learned that my way of working is that when I'm writing a longer essay, I have to start with an outline. I have to start with the introduction. I don't do well with actual outlines. I'm getting a little bit better, but generally I have to write the introduction word for word. And I write it through and I read it and I don't like it because I realize I'm walking myself into a corner. It's not going to work. I go back, I rewrite it. This takes me a full day. Then I put it aside. And when I come back the next morning, I sit down and I actually rewrite the whole introduction and I restart and I just keep on going. And all of a sudden it flows. I have no idea why. I can't explain it. But knowing that, I tried to trick myself and I thought, all right, I'm just going to sit down. I'm going to hash out this quick outline, this quick introduction, and then I'll actually get to the work tomorrow. It never works. I can't do it. There is something about the process that my brain needs that sends me through the thoughts over and over again in the writing of the introduction that allows me to just keep going the next day. So, what I'm saying is you can trick yourself, but only so much. You can set yourself fake deadlines, you can set yourself simple goals, but unless you're really working to them, your brain will eventually kick in and tell you what you needed to know, which was go back and actually do the process that works for you. So I think in terms of how to just start, there is no simple answer. There is only the answer that says that once you figure out how to start, start that way every time you need to work. And I'll pass off to Alice at that point.
Thank you, Heather. Um, I'm going to come at this from a slightly different perspective. Heather has talked about how to just start working. I'm going to talk about the difficulty of working on what. And for many of us, even those of us who, feel very comfortable writing, feel very comfortable doing field work, maybe love data analysis, maybe are dying to get into sort of work with whatever you've produced in the lab that week, sit down, figure it out. It can still feel the project itself can be a little bit daunting. So I'm going to start by coming out here. I am a procrastinator. I have been a procrastinator probably not my whole life. My memory is that actually, I think up and through high school, I actually wasn't a procrastinator. And I sense that's because I wasn't actually challenged, that I wasn't there was nothing about the work I was doing that forced me to confront my own abilities, my own limits, my desire to speak in my own voice or to say something about the world. But the minute I got to the point where my work, which happens to be in philosophy, but I think this applies to many different disciplines, whether it's, as I say, sort of talking about a lab work, putting together field work, doing analysis, a sort of meta analysis of other people's studies, picking up a particular text and drawing something new out of it, whatever you're doing, once your project is not only something that challenges you, that takes you out of the comfort zone, but also speaks to you, allows you to express something about your scholarly or critical voice in the world, I think that's when the specter of procrastination starts to enter. It can be very difficult to confront yourself head on and to confront yourself head on through the discipline of work. And so I will admit it, I'm a last minuter. I am deadline oriented. I need to be a little bit scared of the deadline before I will really sit down to do it. I have to constantly remember it takes me longer to do things than I think it will take me. I am very good at magical thinking about how long it actually takes me to produce 100 words, 500 words, 1,000 words or more. I can definitely, there's a whole part of my brain that thinks I can turn that out in half an hour. And so a lot of my academic career was shaped by an essay I encountered by another philosopher. This is an American philosopher at Stanford University called John Perry, who also came out as a procrastinator. And I had read his academic work and I was quite delighted by this personal essay. But he argued that he actually found his tendency to procrastination was the key to his academic success and productivity. And that was because he said, here's the key thing: procrastinators don't do nothing while they're procrastinating. Procrastinating only works if you keep yourself busy. The only way you can, because procrastinating involves a kind of self deception. I don't want to think about the thing I have to be doing, but that's okay. I need to clean my house. That's okay. I have never organized my pencils by color, or I have never really sat down to make sense of my stationery drawer, or when was the last time I cleaned out my Dropbox files? Procrastination allows us to avoid the thing that we ought to do that is causing us anxiety by producing a whole list of other things that seem like we ought to do them. And so Perry's point was, you can make this work for you. All you need to do is find the right kind of project that is a bit daunting and use that to motivate all the other projects you actually have to do. So if for you, if the literature review is the daunting part of your project, if it makes you feel like you're going back into the classroom and having to sort of write about other people's ideas, or the literature seems huge, or it's very hard to find a path through it in your own voice, or frankly, you think a lot of these studies weren't done very well, but your supervisor says you have to treat them with respect and you're cranky about it. If the literature review, if you're procrastinating about it, use that procrastination. Allow avoiding my literature review to motivate you to write the introduction and conclusion, to pull together your analysis. Maybe it's just to transcribe all your interviews. Maybe it's to do the really sometimes difficult work of getting all the bibliographic references in order. All of the tasks that also need doing, you can find yourself very, very motivated to do all of them by telling yourself, I am avoiding the literature review by doing all of the other things. Ooh, if I do this, I don't have to do the literature review. If I look up every page number of every quotation I have included in this chapter, I don't have to do the literature review. And what happens is you have then taken a very long to-do list and you've reduced it to one thing. And as scary as that thing is, you can approach it with the confidence that only someone who has checked off 9 things out of 10 on a to-do list can hold, with the sense that, no, I am the kind of person who gets things done. Look at everything I've done. I mean, look at my meta-analysis, look at my results chapter, look at these transcriptions, look at this bibliography. I can handle a literature review. So you, instead of avoiding the scariness of the task that's causing you anxiety, use it to motivate a bout of productivity that then situates you with confidence to come back round to it. So that is the sort of the structured procrastination technique. I first read this, I think, in 2007. And if you go to the website, it's a very circa 2007 era website. So enjoy that little blast from the past. But I've added a couple of things to it myself over the last 20 years. One is, and we're coming back to more self-trickery here, I think really stress as a scholarly skill is all about effectively using self-deception. The other thing I will do, and this feels a little bit embarrassing to admit, is I will ease myself into something hard sideways by not really admitting that I'm starting doing it. I have a couple of tasks, a couple of ways of doing this. One is to just keep a podcast in my ears. So I can't do meaningful work with a podcast playing. I can't listen to a podcast and write. I can listen to a podcast and clean up my email inbox or even proofread for grammar mistakes. So if I don't want to face the chapter I have to write, for example, I can tell myself, I'm just going to go in and clean up what I managed to write yesterday. I won't worry about it. I'm keeping the podcast in and just And it's easier to to get absorbed in a task that doesn't seem scary because you let go of all the fears that are preventing you from getting absorbed and getting into that flow state. But once I'm in that flow state, I tune out the podcast and I will usually take my earbuds out without even thinking about it and find myself going from fixing what's there to starting to write what comes next. But again, if I decided I'm going to sit down and write the next 500 words, I would probably get anxious about it. I'm going to share an anecdote too. I have a friend from grad school. She is now a professor in the States. I'm a professor here. We have been working collaboratively. We've co authored once. We read a lot of each other's work. And to this day, neither of us can start a new project just by writing the first line. Instead, we start every project as if it's an email to the other one. So she would start by writing, "Dear Alice, I have to write this chapter. I don't know where to start. It's really frustrating me. I have to get across the following three things, and I don't know how to do it. And I have to get them across. I want to argue for them in this way." And so she writes as if she's explaining to me, whom she trusts and knows and is a safe space, the challenge that's ahead of her in the chapter. And she lets herself go into more and more detail about the challenge. And before she knows it, she's usually written her introduction. And if that doesn't work, she sends it to me and I say, "Hey, look, here's your introduction. It's this sentence, and this sentence." So if you have a buddy who can be your structured procrastinator with you, I highly recommend this for lots of reasons. It's good to have a support system. But even if you're writing to your grandmother who doesn't actually do biology, or you're writing to your favorite literary or movie comic book hero, or you're writing to your diary, sometimes writing to someone else about the challenge ahead of you allows you to slide in sideways into the challenge. And then, like Heather, I strongly recommend rewards. I have lots of rewards, but my procrastinating secret is that work can be a reward to other work. If there are parts of your project that you like, maybe if you're lucky enough to be doing field work or work in a lab, maybe it's getting to talk to people, getting to work with people on a particular hands-on approach. If it's if you're working in some sort of literary or film or media studies, maybe it's sitting down with the media that brought you into this in the first place and remembering, yes, this, I'm blown away by this director. I had forgotten how much I just loved sitting with this art. Whatever it is, use the work, know what work actually just, maybe you're like me and you're a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? You have a some might say an excessively tidy mind, and just formatting things and cleaning them up and making them look pretty is very satisfying to you. Let that be the pleasant work that you reward yourself for the unpleasant work with. It's another way of sort of sliding into productivity without confronting the whole of the task fully on. The reason I have gathered all of this under structured versus stifling procrastination is I want to emphasize that sometimes having a big to-do list can actually be easier, even though it's stressful, than having a short to-do list. The problem with having only one thing to do is there's no getting around it. You just have to do it, and you might not want to. And so this comes back into the breaking up into chunks, but from a slightly different angle. The more you can take your project as a dissertation, good Lord, what a terrifying thing, and break it into actually 6 chapters, a whole bunch of bibliographic things, a certain number of transcriptions, a certain number of analyses, running this particular program, pulling together these figures for your illustrations, whatever it is. Once you have a nice long to-do list, the to-do list becomes a kind of topography or a terrain. And as you hike your way and journey through the terrain, there's parts you're looking forward to. Some of it's downhill and smooth, or some of it's beautiful. And you can use that to plan a journey that balances out the stressful with the non-stressful or less stressful or differently stressful, and use both sides to feed into the other, which I think increases your productivity overall. Now, I say all this, I don't want to pretend all procrastination is good. I have definitely screwed myself over with my own procrastination. I have produced work that wasn't as good as it could have been. I have let people down. I have been late for things, and that is not ideal. And so I don't want to say all procrastination, if you just structure it right, is good. I think it's important, again, this comes back to knowing yourself, to start to recognize the signs of procrastination that is going to stifle you rather than structure your project. Sometimes I think I know it's stifling procrastination if I've made my own monster, if I have created a monster under the bed. And it's amazing how I can do this. Even after 2 decades of writing papers, I can convince myself a paper is a monster. A paper is not a monster, it's just a paper. And it's literally made of paper. And these days it's just made of icons on a screen. And it can lead to burnout. And this is one of the things I want to flag. So, we are emphasizing stress as a scholarly skill, but I'm really glad that Heather started by acknowledging when stress becomes anxiety. And I think another thing is when stress becomes burnout. So, tricking yourself into doing all of these things is a little bit like tricking your body at the gym to working harder and harder and harder. And there are ways by switching up muscle groups, by alternating cardio and non-cardio, by planning sort of your rest and recovery time, you can push yourself a lot farther. But crucially in there is the rest and recovery time. And I want to caution you against structuring yourself into hyperproductivity to the point that you get to a sense of burnout where you're continuing to produce, but it's just depleting you. So in all of our techniques for continuing to push through to work and to use the stress you have, I want to remind you that stress can also be like any skill, it can be overused. Like any trait, it can be pushed too far. And so remember to be aware of either a kind of frozen anxiety where you make your own monster. That's where it's sort of you let the procrastination take over. And on the other hand, you get so good at turning procrastination into productivity that you talk yourself into burnout. So keep a sense of the middle ground here. It's a big middle ground. There's lots of room for structured procrastination. Just be aware of on either side. And actually, this flows nicely into our next slide, which I'm also going to talk, which is exactly how to build the kind of structure that keeps you comfortably between sort of fearful, anxious procrastination on the one side and burnout on the other. So let me pivot a little bit and talk about how to build your own structure. And so there's really only two things you can structure: the work and you. Those are really the two elements here: the work to be done and the person doing the work. So how do you structure the work? Well, first of all, try not to think of it as a whole most of the time. When I was writing my dissertation back in grad school, I lived in a different country than my partner at the time, my partner now. And one of the things I used to joke is I couldn't bear to be alone in the room with my dissertation. This was pre-Zoom. We actually had Skype, and sometimes we would just Skype just so I could see a face in the corner, even though my partner was going around the apartment doing housework or something like that, or doing something entirely different. So I wouldn't be alone with the enormity of this thing that was my doctoral dissertation that felt bigger than me. That's a good technique if you can. Don't be alone with it. Set up support systems. I mean, this falls under the more traditional self-care and stress management. Have writing buddies, have accountability buddies, have buddies who have nothing at all to do with graduate school, so you're forced to talk about something else, do all that. But also, you don't have to be alone in the room with your dissertation if you don't think of it as a dissertation, or even as a paper or a chapter, that you find ways to break it into smaller chunks. Now, the way we've set up sort of graduate school at York, we've tried to do this a little bit for you by creating milestones. So you have coursework, and then you might have something like comprehensive exams and something like a proposal if you're writing a dissertation. And then you get to the point where you're writing. You might have to submit an ethics review before your research and so on. But you can reproduce that by building milestones into your internal research or writing process, whatever it is. If you're doing research creation and turn into your creative process. And I highly recommend building as many milestones as you can. Chapters are an obvious one, but that doesn't have to be the only one. Sort of stages of collecting data, formatting data, analyzing data, reflecting on the analysis, producing this sort of discussion, getting to the results. Those can also be milestones, but you might find a different one. You might do it by words in writing. You might do it by, if you're looking at a geographic area, you could divide the geography and look at different areas. You could think about different parts of your investigation, but find milestones that allow you to make sense of and feel a sense of accomplishment from having meeting them. And then along with milestone, I mean, another word for milestone is a deadline. And it's, it can be a slightly more stressful way of talking about milestones, but I think it can be equally useful. Without a deadline, there is no reason ever to write the dissertation today or to produce the chapter today and not tomorrow. And so deadlines can help orient us in time as we move through our project. But you need to know whose deadlines work for you. Gretchen Rubin, who was a clerk to the US Supreme Court and then sort of pivoted to becoming a writer. And I guess I would describe her as a kind of productivity or self help writer, talks about something called the four tendencies. And really, these tendencies are just what your orientation to deadlines are. She divides these into, let me get this right, upholder, obliger, questioner, and rebel. And this all has to do with what your attitude is to the deadlines and expectations that other people set for you or that you set for yourself. Upholders they like all expectations. They meet external expectations, they meet internal expectations. Someone gives them a deadline, they go for it. Obligers, I'm an obliger, are incredibly good at meeting other people's expectations and other people's deadlines. And if something is asked of them, if a supervisor tells me the deadline is April 1st, I will get you something by April 1st. If I tell myself the deadline is April 1st, those are words. They might bear some reality to April 1st. They might not. We'll never know. Questioners are the opposite to me. Questioners can be incredibly good at being very hard on themselves. If it's due by March 15th, come hell or high water, if they have decided that, they will get it done. But if I, as their supervisor, and I'm not saying any of my students are questioners, say, could you get it to me by March 15th? All of a sudden, that is the man. That is someone from outside telling them what to do, and they instinctively push back against it. The fourth tendency is rebel. If you're a rebel, you would have something in common with some of the greatest minds in history, but it's tricky to get through academic institutions because you kind of rebel against both internal and external expectations. And that's where all our techniques of self-deception come in, where you have to sort of ease your way sideways into expectations, talk yourself into it not being an expectation, but rather just the natural outcome. And so I think thinking about what kind of deadlines work for me? Do I need my supervisor do I need to say to my supervisor, I need you to set me deadlines? I'm so sorry, not just for each chapter. I need you to set me a series of 2,000 word deadlines. Tell me I'm going to get you 2,000, I'm going to write 2,000 words by this, 4,000 by this, 6,000 by this. If they're a good supervisor and you explain why you need it, they'll probably do that. I mean, I don't know how much work they want to put into chasing you down around it, but they can certainly set the deadlines. If you are better motivated by your own deadlines, leave them out of it. You set them. Think about what a good pace is and set that for yourself. So that's how you manage the project. The other question is how you manage yourself as the person doing the project. And the next slide is going to talk about knowing who you already are. I want to say do some work on yourself. Build yourself a little bit. You came to graduate school to learn. One of the things you're learning is all over again, just like you did in elementary and high school and university the first time, you are learning how you learn. And you are learning how to learn, not just how you learn now. You are going to teach yourself to learn in particular predictable ways, because that is the most effective way to be able to produce what you need to produce, to be able to journey where you need to go. And so I encourage you not just to know your habits, but also to build habits. And this is a little bit investigation and a little bit self-work. So figure out what time of day works for you. Are you a morning person? Are you an evening person? But when you've figured it out, don't just go with the flow. Insist on being that kind of a person. So if you are a morning person, try and write every morning or most mornings. If you're an evening person, vice versa. Figure out your relationship to things like measurements, diagrams, checklists. I'm a fan of all of them. If I could just have my whole life in a very complicated bullet journal style spreadsheet and diagram, I would probably do that. I've never seen a kind of gamified checklist that didn't appeal to me on a very deep spiritual level. So if you're like me, use that. If you're not, figure out what does, but have some sort of measurement approach that it gives you, because this isn't to hold yourself accountable in the sense of berating yourself. This is to give you a sense of the progress you are taking. because we all think we do less than we do. And it is astonishing to notice how 5 days in a row of only writing 250 words, you're over 1,000 at that point. You've gotten somewhere. That's the beginning of the shape of something. Last point, since I've started praising you, now I'm going to bring you back down to earth. We are also all Pavlov's dog. If you can build a place or a time where you work, it's amazing how putting yourself in that place or time, you sit down and do the work. So if there is a chair and a desk that you only sit at and you write, don't let yourself slip into doing other things there. If there's a cafe where once you wrote, you just had a really productive day, go back to that cafe, but make sure you're going back, if not to reproduce that productive day, because let's face it, not all days are alike. You're going back to that cafe not to scroll your phone, but to do something like that kind of work again. Continue to build these sort of reflexes such that your brain goes, oh, yeah, here I am. This is where I write. And then you write. Or, oh, yeah, this is where I do this particular task. And then you do it. And then my last advice, and I say this with all the well-intentioned, authentic, and slightly patronizing warmth that only a mother and a professor can say is like, create your own comfort. Take care of yourself. Don't forget your drink of choice, your beverage of choice, both hot and cold. Don't forget to make sure that your senses feel good, that you're not in uncomfortable clothing in uncomfortable spaces around people who make you uncomfortable. These things are inevitable and we can never, no one can write in a utopia, but as much as possible, take all the other things that cause stress and anxiety and existential crisis out so that you can just be focused on the strength and existential crisis and anxiety of your work. And that way you have chunkified the work and figured out what kind of milestones work for you. And then you have built spaces, times, habits, and measurements that allow you to take best advantage of it. And that, I think, is the kind of structure you can work with. So I will turn things over to Heather for our last slide of techniques.
All right, this is great because I think in a way I'm going to try to tie some of this stuff now back together in the know yourself. I think it's interesting that a lot of things that Alice and I were saying, I mean, we to some extent we discussed what we were going to say, and to some extent we kind of didn't. But there's a lot of overlap, especially around this idea of creating your routine, create your space, know what works. I'm going to kind of flip this a little bit again to sort of put myself out there. I'm a control freak. That's my thing. I like control. The hardest thing for me in grad school and even now starting projects was actually I'm not in control. There are so many things that are outside of the realm of my control. And that's not just because somebody else is imposing a deadline. I can create the illusion of control by giving myself a different deadline, right? And I think this is very much about those different types of people. I'm not sure if I'm a questioner or what my tendencies are, but I think I'm an upholder probably. Um, but I think that it's very much about taking the control where you can get it. And so that I think is my first piece of advice, if you will, is know how to be in control and know what you can be in control of. So maybe you control the time of day that you work. Maybe you control the place that you work. Maybe you control, whatever small music is going on in the background or whatever it is. Know what you can control so you don't feel like you are entirely outside of this picture. This is your project. Whatever it is that you're working on, it is your project. And the way to make it your project is for you to control as many of the small little pieces as you can. And you will never control them all. But depending on what you need, you can control some of the most important pieces. So, how do we get to that? I know we want to do some questions, so I'm going to wrap up as quickly as I can. Be your own research subject. I would say keep a work diary for a little while. These habits and routines that we're talking about, it takes a while to create a habit. Studies show that it actually takes about 6 weeks of repeated actions in order to create a habit. So, as much as you may not be the keep a list kind of a person or the organized person, try keeping a list very shortly, like a diary of what you did in the day, and then have an assessment at the end, what worked and what didn't work. Try things more than once in order to see what is working. Because what you may actually find, working with headphones on works great when you're in the cafeteria, but it doesn't work well when you're at home. So you need to start to piece together really what is your ideal space. And by space here, I'm actually thinking all of these different things that you can control. And like I said, personally, I would keep it as a work diary so that you know what is working. Um, Routine is absolutely sacred. And sometimes I would come back to that, go outside your comfort zone and think about if maybe there's a time of work, a time of day that works for you that you haven't even thought about. I ended up writing the vast majority of my dissertation between 5 and 7:30 in the morning because for some strange reason, it actually worked for me. I woke up one time because I was just, it was, I don't know, whatever. I wasn't feeling well, whatever. I woke up early and I thought, well, there's nothing else to do. I may as well sit down and start writing. And I found that the silence around me in the neighborhood, in the apartment, everywhere, totally fueled my ability to work. So 5 to 7 in the morning has become my productive time. What is sacred about that time is I don't touch the emails. There is a non-productive time of my day. That's when I deal with emails. So know what work fits into what time frame. To move on again, because I know we're getting tight here, balance is key. You are in a weird position as graduate students right now in that in many ways you're already in the work world, but in many ways you're also still a student. And so it's like trying to find this balance now where everything is a little bit new. And for some of you, you may also be parents or partners or caregivers or whatever else. You need that balance. So whatever structure you need for you, you need to create that and don't let it go. If there is a time of day, if you're a caregiver and your young kids come home from school at 3:30, don't plan to do anything between 3:30 and 4 o'clock. That's your time for them. But no, okay, maybe I have to go back at 8:30 and do a half an hour to finish those things up because now my kids are in bed. So know what you need, and that also includes going to the gym or looking after yourself or going for that cup of coffee with a friend. All of those things, if you have to schedule them in because taking care of yourself in the time outside of work is going to make your work time more productive. Um, don't beat yourself up if you don't get everything done in a day that you wanted to get done. Maybe you were unrealistic about what could be done. And if that's regular, then like regularly happening, then think about what kind of goals are you setting because maybe you're being too ambitious. Scale back a little bit. If you get off track, oh well, this is a long-term project. You get off track. Does anybody watch Ted Lasso? Be a goldfish. Just be a goldfish. And the whole, for those who didn't watch Ted Lasso, the whole idea of be a goldfish was goldfishes have the shortest memory of all species or of all animals. And so something happens, they've already forgotten it. You had a bad day, shake it off and start fresh tomorrow because you will be more productive than if you constantly remember that you had that bad day. Um, so I think, all of these sorts of things, it feels on the one hand for me, who likes things neat and tidied up, it feels like we're not giving you tools. But I think the biggest tool that we can give you is to really stress that you need to figure out your quirks. And we all have them. And honestly, I think some of the little things that I have that make me work well, I won't even share because they're kind of quirky. They're kind of weird, but for some reason it's been internalized into my work schedule. And so it's okay. Like I said, maybe one of the less quirky ones, well, working 5 to 7 in the morning might be kind of quirky. I like to have a hot beverage on my desk. First thing in the morning, I need a hot beverage. Doesn't matter what it is, I need my hot beverage. So if I sit down raring to work and there's no coffee or tea on my desk, I got to get up and go downstairs and get my hot tea or beverage or tea or coffee. Think about what those things are, embrace them because they are what will help you to control, to go back to the very beginning of our presentation, we talked about moving from the comfort zone to the uncomfortable zone. The uncomfortable zone where you're learning doesn't have to be the entire life. You don't
Hmm.
need to be uncomfortable as a whole. You need to be challenging yourself, which means creating the comfort where you can so that the stress doesn't overwhelm and move into that anxiety zone, and you can use it to your advantage. So maybe that's where I'll tie up so we have time and we can also look at the resources.
That's perfect. Thank you, Heather. I actually think I've had the chance to get briefed on some of the questions, and I think some of the questions, particularly about resources around well-being available at York, how to manage these things, I think they will be answered on this slide. So, as Heather was saying at the end, we have been trying to push you to think about a very particular source of stress about academic work as something that doesn't necessarily take away from your capacity to do that work, but can be marshaled as a skill, largely through self knowledge and experimentation and research into your learning and your researching habits. But of course, you're all researchers, so that's why you're here. But I want to take a moment to acknowledge not all stress looks like that, not all stress comes from there. And, graduate students at York, the world is a very complicated place right now and a very, very stressful place. And many of you are facing things, outside of work. Many of you are balancing academic work and employment, caregiving, community care, activism, personal traumas and stresses and histories. Many of you are international students who have come from far away and may be facing cultural shock, loneliness, isolation. And so I want to take a minute to acknowledge that we are not trying to Pollyanna stress to say that all stress is good and fun and great and you just need the right attitude towards it. And so I want to take a moment to point out some of the resources around well-being that can help you confront, cope with, sometimes reduce, otherwise just live with very real sources of stress and anxiety. So please keep in mind graduate student wellness services here at York, as well as student counseling, health and well-being. Both have in-person, phone, video counseling. With student health and well-being, you can get same-day sessions sometimes, and there are also physical spaces on campus. In terms of support, for academic support, there's both the Writing Center and the York Learning Skills Services. You can get these by Googling them or by following these websites. They're available through York. Because, as Heather was saying, life isn't just about academic work, and sometimes exercise can, for those who are able, can be a very good source of dopamine and all the good hormones that help you cope with academic work. I recommend taking a look at York Athletics and Recreation as well. And then if you Google stress management, any of the articles that come up will suggest something like mindfulness, whether that is a spiritual practice for you or a more traditional meditation. We also have listed a couple of mindfulness apps that you can use on your phone or tablet or device, like Calm, Headspace, Balance. Some of these have free as well. There are mindfulness classes. If you look on YouTube, there's even, along with sort of yoga and other kinds of physical mindfulness programs, you can find meditation and breathing programs to do as well. For those of you who are experiencing isolation and homesickness, particularly because you are an international student or far from home, I encourage you to reach out to York International or other sources of support at York. Any connections to diasporic or community organizations here, find your people, find their food, be able to go and hear your own language spoken. That can be very, very helpful and useful. Yeah, so take a look at these services and supports. Please be sure to care for yourself as whole human beings, as well as researchers and academics, because you are valued and you matter as whole human beings. And I think that's where I will leave that. So we have still a few minutes for questions. And I believe our wonderful support folks are going to read some of these questions out.
I'm an international student doing my master's at York. Being away from the familiar has led me to feelings of loneliness and isolation. Do you have any tips on dealing with being homesick or feeling isolated?
Yeah, this can be such a challenge. I want to acknowledge I did 2 of my degrees away from Canada, although for the most part, except for 1 year in my first language. So I've had some of this experience, but not all of it. My advice is to make sure you have ways to connect to home, whether that is Zoom dates, phone calls, if media allows, emails. Make sure you are reaching out and that people are writing to you or reaching you back so that you maintain those connections if you can. The next suggestion is to find your people if you can, even if that's off campus, going into a particular part of town or to a particular restaurant or something like that. But if at all possible, finding student organizations at York that represent some sort of affinity to you, whether it's your home or ethnicity or something like that, or whether it's just something that's deeply important to who you are, maybe a sport or a recreation or something like that, start to find ways that you can create quasi homes here while making sure you stay connected to your actual home there, and give it time.
And I think the one other thing I would add to that, once you've gotten over that part, because I also remember as an international student, I did a year abroad as well, and same thing, different language, different culture, all of that. Become curious once you're able to, once you're over the real lonely phase. Become curious about where you are. And if
Mhm.
you look online, there's a really interesting, I don't know if I can I can't get the exact wording of it. There walks in Toronto neighborhoods always from a subway station. And you can just start randomly get on the subway, get off somewhere, and if you're able, walk around that neighborhood, even follow the little paths, and you will find all sorts of gems that become little things that you can start to connect to. Even if it's not about connecting to your actual home, it's a way to make where you are an alternative home. And I think that there's a transition that happens the longer you're in a place where you start to be able to be in both places at once. And that's really a very, very special place once you can reach that point.
Thank you
I like
both so
that.
much. Here's another question. Publishing papers and contributing to the academic field is often expected, but it can also be stressful and challenging. Do either of you have any tips on managing the pressure of publishing?
Boy,
Don't
do I
take
feel that for sure. Yeah, go ahead, Heather, you first.
don't take it personally. I think there is such a tendency for us to create stress because our work is a reflection of who we are. And I think we have to separate that a rejection of your publication is not a rejection of you as a person. It's a reminder that you maybe sent it to the wrong place. You maybe pitched it in the wrong way. You maybe need to just rethink something. But I don't think that we should ever think about our own self-worth being tied up with that publication. And when you can distance yourself from it, it becomes a little bit less stressful to put yourself out on that paper and to send things out. I have lots to say about that, but I'll pass to Alice.
No, I think that's very good advice. And I would recommend maybe it's your supervisor, maybe it's someone else in the department. Find a faculty member with the right sort of attitude, with a sort of pragmatic, compassionate attitude towards publication. Because yes, the pressure to publish is there, and any faculty member who pretends otherwise isn't actually protecting you from it. Because if you are interested in continuing in academia or in scholarship, you will be expected to have some sort of a record of your findings to be contributing to the academic conversation. But I think sometimes you have the sense, oh, that means I need to publish in a top journal in my field before I'm even out of grad school. No, just no to that. So find a faculty member who can help you think pragmatically and realistically about your work, help you find good homes for it, and who's also not going to be afraid to tell you stories of how many times they've been rejected. I have one paper that I really love, and I think it's one of my best papers. It got rejected from every major journal in my field. No one liked it. I ended up sticking it in a collection that where they were just soliciting contributions. It's not even peer reviewed. I know it's a good paper in my heart, and people have cited it, but everyone hated it. And that's just what there is. And I have so many stories like that. And so does anyone. Anyone who has a CV full of publications has an equally long imaginary CV. No, much more than equally, four
Longer.
times as long CV of rejections. So learn to be okay with rejection, get someone to give you pragmatic advice, and be realistic about what is needed. You are creating a record of your contributions to a scholarly conversation. You don't yet need to dominate the conversation. You don't yet need to change the conversation. You are, in the same way that you would sit down with a group of people who are already talking, you're finding your way into it and how to increase and broaden it. And I think having what you're expected in terms of the contribution put in context can also help. And also be realistic about timelines. Remember, you send something out, people don't get back to you for a while. So plan that as well and know that there's going to be a lot of waiting. And this is where self-deception comes in handy because you're going to need to distract yourself.
Thank you so much, Alice and Heather. I think that takes us to time, so I'll let you wrap up, Alice.
I just want to say once again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining our Scholarly Skills webinar. Thank you for this conversation. This was a new direction for us. It felt brave to try to start to explore some of the less familiar scholarly skills. If you look on our website, you'll see we've talked about publishing your work, getting over fear of public speaking and conferences, how to start a major project, how to be supervised and work with your supervisor, the road to defense. We've covered some of the more traditional ones. And going forward, we're going to start to explore the lesser known scholarly skills, of which one of which is stress. This webinar will be available on our YouTube channel next week. I also invite you to stay connected to us as we continue to produce this webinar and other resources available to York students and beyond. And I think I speak for both Heather and me when I say very sincerely, good luck to all of you. We
Absolutely.
absolutely have faith in you as stressed out researchers, just as we are. And we know that we are going to cultivate this skill as best we can. So thank you so much for joining.